Celeste is pretty good. I give it like a 10 out of 10, I guess. So this summer I played Celeste, and it's definitely the greatest video game ever made, and one of the best pieces of media ever created. It tackles mental health, trans issues, and generally accepting yourself in a perfect way that made me cry twice when I first played it, and still makes me cry to this day. Its platforming and game mechanics is incredible. You could spend 2 hours on a screen, and then after beating it, just get more excited to see what the game throws at you next. So I figured for Celeste's 6-year birthday, I would rank every Celeste chapter from worst to best, just to honor it, I guess, and probably talk about the best thing I've ever talked about on this channel. And yes, I will be covering the entire story, so obvious spoilers for all of Celeste. Please play the game, it's actually very good. I'm gonna try to cover metaphors and the meanings of certain levels of the game, but I honestly can't cover a ton of it, and most of what I talk about is taken directly from the Celeste Reading a Masterpiece video, which is great, and I highly recommend you check out. If you want to experience a much more detailed look at the story and meaning of Celeste, just watch that, it's very good. I'll also be talking about the mechanics of certain levels and gameplays, but note that I won't cover things like B-sides and C-sides or Crystal Hearts. But for your information, my favorite Crystal Heart is probably Chapter 8, if that counts. And my favorite B-side is Mirror Temple because Theo has more lines and they're pretty funny. So that's mostly everything out of the way. Let's rank every Celeste chapter from worst to best, starting with...
Boom! Haunted
Hotel.
I've played Chapter 3 hundreds of times during the writing of this video in order to get the Golden Strawberry for it, so I spent a lot of time thinking about this chapter, and it's very clear in my eyes that this is pretty easily the worst chapter in Celeste. The craziest thing about it is that this is still a pretty good, very solid chapter. I mean, I played it hundreds of times for the Golden Strawberry, and it never really felt that tiring to me, but still, this is easily my least favorite in the game, but it's more of like a mixed bag than anything. To start off with the positives, this is a great extension of Chapter 1 and Chapter 2 gameplay-wise. There's some great ideas here, like moving platforms, like having walls that you can only grab onto for a short period of time. They use that mechanic to create what is probably the best strawberry in the game too. The keys here are very well used too, feeling very balanced, even though I do think they are used better in Chapter 5. My favorite segment of this chapter is easily the part where you have to clean the hotel with the 3 different rooms. They're all different, and I love how a lot of the obstacles are junk you clean up, so each room, no matter what you choose, gets harder and harder, and different platforms disappear, so you have to strategize on which rooms you want to clear up first. That's genius. I enjoy a lot of the screens in this, and I don't think any of them are too frustrating and are pretty good, and they're a pretty good increase in difficulty from Chapter 2. Also, this one follows up Chapter 2 with a banger boss fight that's very creative, and I like it a lot. Anyways, that's most of the good stuff that comes to mind. Mostly, my biggest issue is more of a personal thing, but I am not a fan of the sludge mechanic, which is something the entire chapter relies on. It's all timing based, and that's just really not fun to play with. For a game that lets you go at your own pace in basically every other chapter, forcing you to slow down and get used to a pattern is just so lame and not fun at all. When you get better at the game, you can speed through it all, and it's not that bad, but when you start off after the Chapter 2 boss encouraging you to never stop at any point, it's just really lame, honestly. Also, I'm gonna mispronounce this, but Mr. Oshiro, or however you say his name, is good, but he never really does anything for the rest of the game until the very end, and Madeline showing up only right at the end is kind of out of nowhere. Theme-wise, it's also kind of weak, barely focusing on Madeline at all, and more on the hotel owner. So in general, it's the weakest chapter of Celeste, but it's still got its great elements.
So I don't know about you, but I literally hate the wind.
Golden Ridge is a nice little way to take a break from the story of the game and just focus on this beautiful setting. Visually, Golden Ridge is probably the best looking chapter of the game up until this point. The way it's shown to be a sunset in this level with the beautiful background and great music is so well done. It gets better later on, but this one is beautiful to look at. Anyways, let's talk about the mechanics. I like the cloud, it's fine here, but definitely gets used better during Summit and Farewell, but it's a nice little starting point for this mechanic. The green bubbles are also pretty good, but they get used to create probably one of the best mechanics in the game later on, so they're kind of just a prototype. There's some pretty good dialogue with Granny at the start and a fantastic ending with Theo towards the end, which is definitely the highlight of the entire chapter. It's really well done, and it's a great representation of an actual panic attack. The music and the way it's shown through a feather is paid off incredible later on too. Anyways, this is a great chapter, so why is it so low? I cannot stand the wind. It is actually insufferable in Golden Ridge. I feel like most people can agree on this, but it just kind of sucks throughout it. It can be used creatively sometimes, like this level here, but it's such an annoying mechanic. Almost all it does just slows you down to make the game 10 times more frustrating and annoying. Later chapters use wind in a much more creative and better way, but in this chapter, literally all it does is slow you down and makes the chapter so much harder, and not in a fun creative way, just in a really annoying way. Honestly, now it's not that big of an issue because of wave dashing, but when you first play the game, it is actually insufferable. Anyways, besides this is still a great chapter.
Now what?
Alright, Golden Ridge and Celestial Resort were both good chapters with some issues. Now we're getting into the great stuff, starting with Core. I'll just talk about what is probably the biggest issue with this chapter. It's so bizarre ending the game on such a high note and then just resuming the story. It was very off-putting when I finished Summit and then I started Core and I just got a hard cut to 1 year later. Of course, these issues also apply to Farewell, but that one actually felt like a proper expansion of the game. Core just feels very off. It still adds to the game with it explaining more about the mountain and giving another decent ending with Madeline finding inner peace, but I don't know, still, I think it's weird to give Madeline another ending in this chapter. It's really strange, especially since Farewell literally starts with her at her lowest of lows. Anyways, that's my only real issue. This chapter is great gameplay wise. Limiting you to one dash can be annoying, but unlike chapter 3, this chapter is already at a point where you're good at the game, and it's really creative and actually gives you a lot of interesting puzzles when you have to figure out how to solve puzzles with 2 dashes. The fire and ice mechanics are fantastic. I love how you can go through the game avoiding dangerous fireballs, and then you have to backtrack with it being much more peaceful and easy to dodge. But when you set the place to ice, it also has disadvantages like freezing some of the boost mechanics that are part of the fire levels. That's basically the cleanup part of chapter 3, but done 5 times better. The story is a bit lacking. We get more epic granny moments and the bird goes straight through a wall, but that's about it. It really doesn't capture that loneliness that was in the other chapters, even though this is probably the one with the least dialogue in the entire game. Also, having 5 strawberries is kind of strange, but I actually really like that. It shows that Madeline is fully focused on reaching the center of the mountain, and you're not exploring, you're just going straight in one direction, or at least as straight as you can get when this chapter has so much backtracking to it. Still, the reflection just does this better, so it's kind of still a bit strange. Anyways, the reason why this chapter is so high up is because of that final scene, which is an incredible way to end off this chapter. Once Madeline reaches the core, there's an empty void, and in the middle of it all is a crystal heart, and the final scene is Madeline finally coming to inner peace, which is incredible. Probably the best end screen to any chapter in the game, and we're comparing this to Summit and Reflection, so it's gotta be good. This feels like way too high of a placement for such a short and simple chapter, but Forsaken City is just the perfect way to start this game off. For some reason, I hear a lot of videos on Celeste talk about how the main mechanic of this chapter is moving platforms, which I guess it is, but really the main mechanic here is just dashing. The prologue shows us climbing and setting up Madeline as a character, but this whole chapter is mostly just getting us used to dashing. And while dashing is basically used in every level of Celeste, it still does a fantastic job at introducing us to dashing as a mechanic and showing us acceleration with moving objects and also basically the basics of Celeste. It also has a shocking amount of Easter eggs, like Theo's here, which you usually won't encounter, at least for me. I didn't realize he was here until I replayed the game. There's also the golden wing strawberry and this real strange crystal heart that comes back in chapter 6 for no reason. There's also the 1-up, which I know you can get in every chapter, but this is the one where it's the easiest to get. Story-wise, it's very lacking, probably the most lacking in the whole game, but there's something special about that. There's just a sense of complete isolation in this chapter, being in an abandoned city while you just travel alone. And if you never find out about Theo, which happened on my first playthrough, you're fully alone the entire chapter. The ending is also pretty great. There's nothing special about it, but Madeline looking straight into the camera or herself and saying that the whole climb might be a bad idea is such a great foreshadowing, which chapter 2 very much expands on. This chapter also has no Madeline whatsoever, so you truly just feel completely alone the whole time. It's great.
It was like looking in a mirror.
Yep, this one is fantastic. I think one issue I have with this chapter is the ending. Like, I wish they had one ending scene instead of cutting to the chapter end screen, and maybe they could explain what the giant eye was supposed to be at the end. And that's about all the issues I could come up with. This is probably the chapter in the game that is the most character focused. Up until this point, chapters 1 through 4 have been setting up characters like Theo and Madeline for this moment, and it has a fantastic payoff. Going into Madeline's mind is super interesting, and it's definitely where the game gets to its absolute darkest. This is basically anxiety and depression from start to finish, and it's the darkest, most disturbing part of the game. It's not horror or anything, but it just leaves you on the edge throughout the whole thing. Little things like how everything is monotone gray or blood red, and the music having whispering in the background, which when reversed is actually Lena Raine explaining her struggles with herself, which is actually genius, taking something used as a creepy element, but then it actually just being really sad. The chapter's gameplay might be an issue for people. The entire area is always extremely dark, and there's narrow pathways literally everywhere. There is no clear sense of direction for where we're supposed to go, but you're also basically going through someone's head, and I think the game perfectly captures this with the anxiety of being in pure darkness and going through extremely narrow areas. The 2 mechanics of this chapter for the first half are some of my favorites in the entire game. The red bubble is one of my favorites for how it can be used to travel through multiple rooms of the game. Like, that's incredible game design, and the platforms that move when you dash are so much fun, especially when you can go extremely far using acceleration on them. The weird key section is also fantastic. It's really confusing when you first play it, but once you understand what you're supposed to do, it's just incredible. Anyways, time for the best part of the chapter, Theo. I cannot express how funny this man is. He gets himself trapped in here and forces you to carry him throughout the entire chapter. He's also, again, one of the best mechanics in the whole game. You have to throw him over pits and carry him throughout the whole chapter, but he can also sometimes sometimes be helpful, and you can use them to hit buttons and stuff. Also, his dialogue throughout it all is so snarky, but actually very motivating. Thanks, Theo.
What? And I'm just back here now?
This feels like way too high of a placement, but screw it, old site number 4. This is absolutely at the point in the game where I realized that this was one of the best games I had ever played, and it took almost 5 chapters to top this 10-minute experience. I absolutely love the dream block mechanic. It is fantastic. It's super simple, and tons of other mechanics completely outshine it, but this is basically the second mechanic introduced to the game, and it's so creative. There are so many strawberries hidden by dream blocks that you have to dash through to get, and before unlocking dream blocks, you get this giant room with all the strawberries being impossible before going back after unlocking dream blocks with the ability to now get them, which is such great game design. The scene that introduces Madeline breaking the mirror is super great, and the dialogue scene with her is also super great. Story-wise, it's not a lot. It's, again, more build-up, but it is essential and done super well. Obviously, the standout here is Madeline's chase scene because, like, jeez. It's kind of basic, but it's definitely when I decided this was one of the best games ever because it is just so much fun to play. The ending scene with Madeline's mom and Madeline's ex are both equally great ways to end off the story. And of course, the legend Theo is here, and he might actually be the best part of the whole chapter. He's kind of something you can already do in chapter 1, but I feel most people run into him here, like I did, and it's such a great interaction to have. Oh yeah, and of course I almost forgot this, but the music in this one is incredible. It's absolutely the reason why some scenes here work so well. Ever heard of this track, Resurrections? It's pretty good. If you haven't played Celeste and need some motivation, just hear the song, and you'll probably want to play the game. Other than that, I don't have much more to add. It is fantastic. Alright, so we got the good chapters, then we got the great chapters, then we got the masterpieces. Yes, I stole this from Village Productions. But now past this point, we got the big boys. These are all 10 out of 10s in my opinion, and my favorite moments in any video games evers. All 3 of these are beloved, so there aren't going to be any real surprises, but regardless, let's just get into it. This is probably going to be the last big surprise on the list. I originally was going to put this at number 2, like most lists seem to do, but regardless, here's Summit. This chapter is absolutely amazing, but in comparison with Reflection, I do think this one isn't quite as good, but it is still an actual masterpiece. I guess my favorite part of Celeste is its story, and this one doesn't really have a ton. It's just the final part to the story that mostly concludes already in the previous chapter. This is just an ending of sorts, but it's a really incredible ending. This one just has the sense of hype and excitement all around it. You actually want to climb this whole mountain from bottom to top again because of the music, and it's super exciting and difficult gameplay. The music is just like, whoa, I mean, like, geez, you did not have to go that hard, but they did it, and it makes this whole experience worth it. The whole point of the game was to climb the mountain, so when you finally do it and you just watch the view at the end, it's one of the best moments in the game and a perfect way to wrap this up. It's also kind of a metaphor for the game, with Madeline going through her whole journey on the mountain all over again and reflecting on what she could have done better with battling throughout the whole thing. I really don't have a lot more to add since it's already been talked about a lot, but it is a perfect way to end this game off.
Your life is everything. You serve all purpose.
Dude, I can't believe how hard this chapter goes. Like, what? I feel everyone agrees it's fantastic, but not on the level that I love it. For the longest time, this was absolutely my favorite chapter of the game, but I still think the #1 spot is better gameplays-wise and better story-wise. But seriously, the story in this one is just unbelievable. Before I get into that, I guess I'll talk about the gameplay. It's still fantastic as expected. The feather is an incredible metaphor, but also it's a great mechanic in general. The Kevins are really funny. They're actually really fun to bounce off of, but nothing that's too different from other mechanics. These bouncing thingies are also pretty good, just nothing too big in comparison. Really, besides the feather, this is slightly above average gameplay, so, you know, I don't know why it would be all the way up here, but it's because of the story, because the story here is absolutely where the game peaks, at least up until this point. Let me just talk about the opening. This is basically that one dialogue scene with Theo in the old site, but 10 times better. I've replayed this chapter at least 10 times, and unless I'm speedrunning, I go through the entire dialogue scene, because I feel like it's essential to understand both Theo and Madeline. Theo is my favorite character of the game, and seeing more of him explain his own internal struggles is great, especially with the payoff it will eventually get in Farewell. Speaking of beautiful, the next scene is absolutely one of the best scenes in the entire game. The music after the scene with Theo is nothing short of transcendent, some of the best music of the entire game, and seeing the feather be a core mechanic is just one of the best uses of metaphor in the entire game. It's been mentioned several times before as something Theo introduces Madeline to avoid panic attacks, and in the absolute lowest point of the game, Madeline uses the feather and it's one of the core mechanics of this chapter, since she's at her lowest point and she uses it in almost every single room. So it's basically her trying to stay calm at her lowest point. Anyways, the scene where she confronts Badeline is just incredible. Getting rid of Badeline won't fix anything, and the game makes that clear, but also it's just incredible to look at. Look how beautiful the scene is. Like, oh my god, it's so pretty. Once Badeline retaliates and literally exits the dialogue box to destroy the feather, it's pretty terrifying, but it's also just really, really beautiful. I know it's supposed to be intense, but the visuals are just jaw-dropping. Literally losing all your progress at the start of this chapter is so unsatisfying, but it's so worth it for those last two fantastic scenes. Anyways, the rest of the game just goes on. There's a really good talk to Granny, which is also a great scene, and then once we get to Badeline, the game once again absolutely peaks with the perfect ending to the chapter. See, instead of running away from Badeline, this time you're trying to touch Badeline deep. Regardless, it's still fantastic. The whole level literally falling apart as Badeline tries to get away from you is great, and it's still genuinely difficult to this day. I find myself getting stuck in a lot of parts. Once you confront Badeline, you get one of the best scenes of the game, and Madeline accepting herself as both halves, which will still make me cry in replay. It's just so perfect. Finally, after it all, we get the best end titles card, and yep, it's perfect in every way and has some of the best scenes in this already perfect game. It builds up a sense of hype that is fully fulfilled in Summit. Anyways, I wonder what could possibly be next. Ooh. Oh boy, here we go. If you for some reason weren't aware on why I've been hyping up chapters for the number 2 spot instead of the number 1 spot, that's because not a single chapter in this game could even get close to the truly transcendent masterpiece that is Farewell. I feel like I shouldn't be the one talking about this because there are far more people out there who have gone through grief and depression in ways that could allow them to talk about something truly transcendent in a way that felt more relatable. But whatever, I was gonna make a Celeste video, so this was bound to happen. Let's start with mechanics, since I guess that's the weakest part of the chapter. There's the stoplight mechanics that are great and have some pretty great ideas here, even though they are used much less, which makes sense because they're pretty simple and very similar to other mechanics. And then we got the funny fish guys, who are some of the best mechanics in the game. It's still shocking how there's less jokes about these guys. Transporting them around is really funny to me, and I'm not sure why. Then we get the jellyfish, which is easily the best mechanic in the whole game, for one simple reason. This one basic mechanic can do like 40 things during the game. You can hit buttons, you can drift and float, you can fly, you can drop down, you can get double dashes, it can go through electricity, you can use it to collect keys and then trust fall down a tunnel. The jellyfish can do literally everything, and the game perfectly showcases all of this off in a huge room just centered around teaching you how to use the jellyfish and its infinite mechanics. Farewell is actual hell, an extremely long and difficult nightmare of a level, with it getting more and more difficult throughout. On my replay of this level for the video, it still took me 2 hours to get through the entire thing, dying almost 500 times. Farewell is one of, if not the hardest time I've ever had playing a video game, yet throughout it all there's a sense of beauty and power to the pure nightmare this level is. It's an absolute nightmare, but it's a nightmare you never really want to wake up from. I've never had a point in this chapter where I stopped the game. I just wanted to keep going forever. Farewell takes this confusing, overly hard chapter and somehow makes it so enjoyable, it's almost impossible to stop playing it halfway through. The pure length of this chapter also provides the main message of the chapter, being grief. The pure length and confusing puzzles this chapter has makes you feel so tired and exhausted throughout, and once you feel that at its strongest, you really just start to realize, is this what Madeline feels? Is this what grief feels like? Is this what losing a loved one feels like? And yeah, it is. Farewell's gameplay perfectly matches going through a loss, and when you realize that, the dialogue really just starts to sink in. Chasing after things that don't matter, like just a silly little bird throughout the entire chapter, wasting time just to realize in the end that it's just a bird. There's no deeper meaning, and in the end you have to come to terms with that. There's also this pure isolation throughout it all. Even in the most lonely parts of the game, there were at least someone to talk to at one point in each chapter. In this one, it's just you and sometimes Badeline. There's almost no dialogue. For a first playthrough, this can be up to hours and hours of gameplay without a single line. This is absolutely why I can't say this chapter is for everyone. It's so exhausting and hard to get through, but if you just cheat to get the ending, it doesn't feel nearly as rewarding because you don't go through the grief and pain Madeline went through throughout the whole thing. If you truly trudge through this long journey and win, you get the best scene in Celeste by a landslide, which is Madeline saying goodbye to Granny and slowly waking up before talking to Theo, and it being revealed that Theo's grandfather and Granny knew each other before it fades out with Granny's laugh, before it turns dark on a paper of Granny and Theo's grandfather. I don't know how to describe it, but this ending will always break me. There's something so beautiful about such a simple ending to such a complicated, layered, and difficult chapter. Again, I can't recommend this to everyone. It is a struggle and pain to get through. But when you finish it, you'll be in tears, not only because it's over, but also because you might have just experienced the greatest piece of media media ever created. Anyways, happy 6th birthday to Celeste. I cannot think of a better video to start the year off with by covering one of my favorite pieces of media ever made. You should expect more of that this year. I plan on doing more video essays and new series while keeping the same occasional ranking reviews that I usually do. Thank you for all the support, and this is an epic outro.